We got to learn a little bit more about Florida State's transfers, specifically from Tuscaloosa. We're talking with Clint Lamb, football analyst for BamaOnLine here in the On3 network, and he's going to give us the lowdown on Florida State's 5 new transfers from the University of Alabama. First of all, Clint, I do want to ask you what the last week has been like, number one, covering this program, and then number two, are Florida State fans on your boards or Florida State, the program, is it an annoyance for Alabama fans? Are they saying enough with these kids leaving from Tuscaloosa to Tallahassee? Or are some of the players that Florida State got like, yeah, those are okay players, but we're Alabama, we'll be okay?
I think right now just there was a certain comfort level with Nick Saban being at the helm, and the fact that he's no longer there, there's a little bit of added, I wouldn't say panic, but, nervousness amongst the fan base. And you losing, all of these players that Florida State was able to land, I feel like we're going to be contributors to some degree on Alabama's team, and I think some of them could have been big contributors. And so Florida State certainly got a couple of, or really a few at this point. I mean, you're up there, what, 5, I believe?
5, yep.
So, it's, offense, defense, a little bit of both. But yeah, it's been an interesting week to say the least. And you also got Caleb Downs that just entered the transfer portal. Mm-hmm. One of the best safeties I've ever scouted, high school, whether you're talking about freshman year, I can't recall seeing a better freshman defensive back than Caleb Downs. So it's been an interesting couple of days for sure.
So we'll go, and it won't be perfectly reverse chronological, but I'll start with linebacker Shawn Murphy. Clint, this is somebody who was more on special teams earlier in the early part of his career for Alabama, but Florida State has been starving for linebackers. They were thin at the position this past season, and they get one in Shawn Murphy, who highly touted coming out of high school. But what can you tell us about Shawn?
I think his situation is more of a product of the other guys that were in that room. You had Deontay Lawson, you had Jahad Campbell, who was a 5-star player, had some inside-out versatility as far as where he could potentially be lining up. You have a guy like Trez Marshall, who was brought in from the transfer portal. That kind of pushed Shawn Murphy a little bit further down the depth chart. But at the same time, I would say when you started getting into linebacker 4, 5, your off-ball linebackers, you couldn't have asked for a better one in college football, in my opinion, than Shawn Murphy. I think with a lot of programs at this point in his career, he would have been linebacker 3, linebacker 2, and then he's also got the potential to eventually emerge as your top linebacker. And so, going to a place like Florida State, it made sense just based off of their need and the fact that they kind of need that defensive field general a little bit. But, as far as his place in Alabama's depth chart or on Alabama's roster the last couple of years, I don't think Florida State fans should be concerned about what that means for his talent. I think it was more so of a product of the guys around him. Very good run stopper. Coming out of high school, I viewed him more as a thumper that hadn't shown a ton in coverage. But I think at Alabama, from the little I've been able to see him, he's been a little bit more fluid than I originally anticipated. So I think he's got some 3-down potential too. I think he could be a really good player for the Seminoles.
That's certainly what they would need, somebody who can play 3 downs, and we'll see this spring what Shawn Murphy brings to the table. Another player, we'll flip over to the other side for a moment, Terence Ferguson, offensive lineman. Florida State is bringing back a lot of veteran presence on the offensive line, but they were telling recruits or transfer portal targets on visits that both guard jobs were open. I understand that Terence Ferguson is a combo interior lineman, but just what have you seen, your assessment of what he can do, and does he slot better in your mind as somebody snapping the football or playing guard?
Well, I thought that from a look perspective, he's always looked like a center to me. But at the same time, I've always thought he could play really any of those 3 interior spots, but I haven't seen him play center. And so until you see it, he played a lot of tackle in high school. He's played guard at Alabama, played a little bit of center as far as warm-ups and, things like that. So there's not a lot to go on as far as his ability to play that position. And Alabama had an opening at center. And the fact that he still chose to enter the transfer portal even before Nick Saban decided to retire, I thought that was rather telling. He might want to be playing, he might want to play guard. Alabama's got Tyler Booker. They had Jaden Roberts, who stepped up and became a key cog in their offensive line, was a game changer for that unit as a whole. And so, Ferguson wasn't looking to play center long term. I could totally understand why he would maybe want to go in a different direction. But he is also, all of these guys, like I said, they're good players. Coming out of high school, 6'4", 290, always felt like, despite that size, he was a much more effective run blocker, even though I think he had some pass protection traits, some of the things that you look for. But at Alabama, I think left guard is probably his key position. If I had to guess, it always felt like watching him, that he was a lot more comfortable on the left side than the right side. But it could just be a situation where you're trying to get a guy comfortable, and once he's given that opportunity over a long period of time, maybe he can make that transition. But yeah, I think he can definitely help Florida State's offensive line. I thought that he was going to be a potential key piece in Alabama's offensive line this year, and so that's one that you look at. And he hadn't locked up a starting job. It wasn't a guarantee that he was going to. And like I said, if he wanted to play guard and didn't want to try out center, there wasn't a clear path to playing time in Tuscaloosa. But he was viewed as a guy who was ready to be one of those next man up type situations. So I think Florida State got to go into him too.
It makes sense. Sounds like a fit because Florida State has a need at guard specifically. So we'll keep an eye out for that in spring practice. One of the guys who'll be blocking for this spring and into the fall, running back Roydell Williams. And this is a physical player, Clint. This is a physical back that kind of seems to be in the mold of what Florida State is trying to get to. If you take a look at what the Noles have done in the portal this offseason, adding a lot of beef, up on the offensive line, strong players in the backfield, DJ Uiagalelei, obviously a quarterback is 250 pounds. Looks like they want to play a little bit more bully ball. Is Roydell Williams going to help them do that?
I think so, yeah. And it's fascinating that you say that because you look at Georgia the last, in 2021 and 2022, they played that bully physical style of football. Michigan this past year won the national championship, played that physical style of football. And so it felt like Alabama was starting to transition in that direction, and they still could be under, Kalen DeBoer. But he's a little bit of a different style. He's going to want to sling the football around. He's going to want to get dynamic play out of the quarterback position. But I think that, when you're talking about Mike Norvell and where he seems to be trying to transition that program, I mean, all these defenses in college football with the way offenses have been set up in the last half decade, 5-6 years, it's felt like more of a lot of teams have gotten smaller defensively. Athletes that can get sideline to sideline, but at the same time, when you're going against a big physical team, they can kind of push you around if you don't have that size. So it kind of feels like some programs are zigging while everyone else is zagging. I personally think that's the way to go. I think this is going to come back around full circle a little bit, and I think Roydell Williams can certainly help them do that. Because, he was the guy. You looked at Justice Haynes, who was a 5-star phenom. Everybody thought he was going to be a big-time year one contributor. You had Jace McClellan, who was a part of the backfield last year. You had Jam Miller, who had shown some really good things in his limited mop-up duty in 2022. And so you started looking at the group, and I personally thought Roydell Williams would probably be the odd man out in that situation. And not only was he not the odd man out, he was the number 2 running back. And at times, he played a key part where he kind of took over primary duties and, did some good things. I think you talk about 3-down ability and pass protection. I think he was relied on in that in a lot of instances. I think he's a powerful runner. He's got really good, as far as elusiveness. And, I think he's an underrated pass catcher. I don't think he's going to be a volume guy there necessarily, but I think he can certainly help in the passing game as far as catching footballs out of the backfield. So when you talk about what Florida State's losing at that position, I think it could be a key part of the rotation.
Flipping from somebody who is going to be catching passes, that's going to be his number one job, is Malik Benson, wide receiver, who was the number 1 player in JUCO just a year ago, coming out of the JUCO circuit. Seems like a strange change for Malik to leave after, a short time with the Crimson Tide. What do you make of that situation? And reading up on him, Clint, I mean, he's got track speed. There's no doubt about that. But what kind of football player is Florida State getting?
Such a fascinating year for Malik Benson because I was sky high on this guy, the number 1 JUCO prospect, 5-star JUCO player. You don't see too many 5-stars coming from the JUCO level. He had the size that you look for, 6'1", 190, 195, somewhere in that range. I thought he was going to be a dynamic playmaker in Alabama's offense. And granted, he started quite a few games. He played a lot of snaps. I think he played the 3rd most snaps amongst Alabama's receivers. And the only 2 that had more was Jermaine Burton and Isaiah Bond, who really the passing game was funneled through. But Benson just couldn't get the targets. I mean, I want to say it was somewhere in the neighborhood of like anywhere from 15 to 20 targets the entire year. It was like 1.5 per game or something. It never really made a whole lot of sense. I don't think I ever saw him get more than 3, and I think he got 3 maybe once. And it just, for a guy who was playing so much, I thought that was interesting. But he's got some blocking ability out there on the perimeter. Like you said, he's got the track speed that you look for. I think he can be a dynamic presence in someone's offense. Maybe that'll end up being Florida State, but I was, based off of the expectations for him going in and the fact that he was, quote unquote, I wouldn't say a day 1 starter in Tuscaloosa, but pretty close. I was very shocked at his limited production, but a lot of that stems from, Jalen Milroe, the passing game that Tommy Reese was calling, the fact that Milroe's never going to get to his second and third reads too often. And Malik Benson, I mean, compared to the other two guys, they were more trusted options, and I think that was his biggest problem. So I think he can make some noise in Tallahassee.
We're talking to Clint Lamb. He's a football analyst and expert for BamaOnLine, part of the On3 network. And we've got a couple more questions for him, including one more defender, Florida State. This is the first person they landed out of the portal. It's safety Earl Little, or defensive back, I should say, Earl Little. Where do you think that this particular player fits for Florida State? Because they run a defense where you could have a slot corner presence that acts like a safety, vice versa. You've got center field type safety over the top. Given what you've seen out of him with the Crimson Tide, where do you think Earl Little fits with Florida State?
Yeah, I like Roydell Williams a lot. I like Terence Ferguson, Shawn Murphy, Malik Benson. Earl Little, to me, was my favorite amongst that group, and that's more of my belief in Earl Little compared to the other guys. Like, this isn't a knock on any of those other guys. It's just Earl Little, to me, really, since he was coming out of high school, top 100 prospect. Really I thought his size coming out of high school being about 160 pounds. He was light, but I thought he was extremely scrappy, a lot more physical than you would think for a guy that size. And when he showed up in Tuscaloosa weighing about 180 pounds, I thought this guy can contribute in year one somewhere. And, he ended up dealing with injuries. He dealt with injuries this past year as well. I think that's been a big issue for him. But he was expected to be Alabama's star defensive back, which is their slot corner, kind of a, typically it's a safety hybrid, but this one was more, Earl Little, I think, is a little bit more comfortable at corner. So it was more of a corner style, but I think he's got excellent ball skills. He plays way more physical than you would think. Even I think he's like 180, 185 now. Plays way more physical than that, in my opinion. And I think that he just needs the opportunity. Alabama, adding Jalen Key out of the transfer portal, the fact that you had the versatility with Malachi Moore where he could play the star position or play safety, it essentially became Jalen Key versus, a couple of other guys. And what I found interesting is that when Alabama started suffering some of those injuries over the course of the year in their secondary, Earl Little wasn't the immediate guy to step up in their place. But I think by that point, Trey Amos was another transfer guy that they had added. The fact that Terrion Arnold could shift inside and play some star where you could get Amos on the field, I think that had a lot to do with it. But, man, I love the way that he plays. I think he could play corner on the outside. I think he could play in the slot. I think he could play at safety. And so it's really just whatever Florida State needs him to do. But I truly believe this guy's a ball player, and I think he's not only going to be a starter for Florida State, maybe not this year. I mean, I would assume probably this year, but I'm not going to maybe make this bold statement this soon. But I think he can end up not only being a starter, but being a star.
Well, it sounds like Florida State got quite the haul here from Alabama. Again, rating from a program with incredible depth. We saw Florida State in the Orange Bowl had a little bit lesser than in terms of depth. So now Florida State is filling those gaps, and Clint Lamb is giving us the insights on that. I want to ask you one more thing, Clint, just before we go. Your perspective of the coaching change at Alabama post Nick Saban. All right, now he's retired. Now you're hearing whispers about who they're going after, and we all know here from a Florida State perspective, there was legitimate concern that Mike Norvell was going to be the next head coach at Alabama, which is why Florida State aggressively extended him, made some concessions in terms of, infrastructure for the football program. What was it like covering this particular coaching change in Tuscaloosa, and how much did Mike Norvell's name come up?
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of a surprising name to some fans for some reason. I mean, in my opinion, just the way that the success that he had prior to, the Jordan Travis injury, and even to a degree after that. You talk about Kalen DeBoer and the job that he did at Washington. Mike Norvell has done some really good things at Florida State, and I think he's well respected among coaching circles. And so, that name started to creep up. Speaking candidly, some fans were very much on board with it. Other fans were not. It's interesting because it was the same approach with Kalen DeBoer until DeBoer was named the head guy. And then fans really started to look into him and realized this guy's a much better coach than I originally anticipated and realized. I think it would have been a situation similar with Mike Norvell. But it was a whirlwind because you don't know, we were talking about or hearing about rumors. Social media rumors about Dan Lanning being in Tuscaloosa when it wasn't even true. So there was a lot of misinformation out there, but I do know for a fact Kalen DeBoer and Mike Norvell were two guys that Alabama was extremely interested in. and I think they preferred DeBoer. But if they would have landed Mike Norvell, I think they would have been plenty happy with that as well. So I mean, it's been an interesting week, that's for sure.
Yeah, well, hopefully you can get some rest. Florida State fans and media alike, these last 6 weeks have been pretty busy. Yours has been on overdrive for last week. Clint, we thank you so much for the insights on Florida State's newest 5 football players from Alabama, and I'm sure we'll be talking to each other down the line here pretty soon.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on, buddy.